Dear Father in heaven, we're so thankful to be here this afternoon. We just ask for your Spirit's presence as we open your word together. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So first thing I want to do, and I probably should just get some of those paper notes myself. So sorry about that. And we're just going to look at the questions, the assignment. And these are on page 10. And again, I apologize for the way these notes are not lined up. So when we ask people, what's the strongest biblical argument for placing the captivity of Daniel early in Jehoiakim's third year of reign? How would you answer that question? Does anybody want to answer that? What's the strongest argument for placing Daniel's captivity early in the third year of his reign, that is, in the fall of 607, rather than in the middle or later in Jehoiakim's third year? What would be the strongest argument for that in your mind, in your understanding? Yes, James.
Well, the way that I look at it is Daniel's right in the book of Daniel, and then chapter 1, verse 1, he's mentioning what the time frame is and that people are, in Babylon.
Okay.
So if it was later, why would he be mentioning the third year instead of a later date?
Okay, you're talking about like the fourth year. So some people believe it's the fourth year based on Jeremiah, which is a misunderstanding, a misreading, thinking that's referring to the 70 years captivity, but it's referring to the 70 years for Babylon, which actually had started 3 years before that. So if you're looking at the strongest argument, Graham presented that Jehoiachin's anointings, the two anointings, and that would be a very powerful argument, at least for me. Not everybody's going to have a different view. But we know that Jehoiachin was anointed when he was 8 and 18. And the reason he would have been anointed when he was 8 would have been at the siege that's talked about in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And since that's actually 9 years apart from the end when he's anointed the second time, and he's 18, it's actually 9 years and a couple of months span in there from the start of Jehoiakim's third year in the fall of 607 to when Jehoiachin would have turned 9 years old. So he had to have turned 9 years old sometime before December, I can't remember the date, December 9th or something like that. So there's a couple of months period in which he could have been 8 years old. So that means he must have just turned 18 at the time he was anointed in 598 after the death of Jehoiakim. So that to me would be a really strong argument. The other argument, which I think is very strong, is that Ellen White says that the succession of Cyrus to the throne marked the completion of 70 years from when the first Hebrews were carried away to Babylon. And if we put that together with a number of other Spirit of Prophecy quotes, which I really didn't go through in the class, but some of them have to do when the decree is, how we place that decree, how we place the fall of Babylon, that it's within about 2 years from when Cyrus succeeds to the throne or succeeds to the throne, that you would have to put Cyrus coming to the throne not in the spring of 536 when he makes the decree, but some months before that, and probably about a half a year before that. So that means 70 years are complete in the fall of 537. So I know those are kind of little technical arguments, but as you start to work through some of this chronology, you should be able to sort through these things and understand them. And sometimes you're going to have to defend them. The other thing that we dealt with is in 607, most scholarship would not recognize anything if it's happening in 607 or 606. That is, they would place the beginning of the captivity in very late in 605, like in December, or 604. And the reason is That document called the Babylonian Chronicles doesn't say anything about Nebuchadnezzar's army in 607. Yet, it is not really, the Babylonian Chronicles is not a record of Nebuchadnezzar's army, it's a record of his father's army. And it only mentions him earlier when he's fighting with his father. So Nabopolassar has an army, because he's the king, and his son, who's the crown prince, has his own army. And he can take his friends out, basically, which is what they are, his buddies, and go and plunder and do all kinds of damage to all these little cities because he's the crown prince of Babylon and he has this big army that he can use. And so he had to have gone to Jerusalem in 607 and taken Daniel captive and a number of other princes of Judah. And he would have at that time also received money from Jehoiakim. So that had to have happened in 607, even though there's no record of it. That is, the Babylonian Chronicles don't record it, but there's no reason they should. And that's a mistake that scholarship makes. So there's a little thing in archaeology, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you don't have evidence for something doesn't mean it didn't happen. You know, another example is 677 with Manasseh's captivity. People didn't even believe that Manasseh was ever taken to Assyria because there was no records of it. It was just something in the Bible. And people believed that it was put there in the Bible because, you know, some political reason. And it was just made up story. But we believe it because it's in the Bible. Now, we happen to now have an Assyrian document called Prism B, where Esarhaddon tells us that he took Manasseh to Assyria. And some people use that as an argument against the fact that he was taken to Babylon, because the document doesn't say he was taken to Babylon. It just says that him and 21 other princes, it names Manasseh by name, was taken by Esarhaddon to Assyria. He just says, I gathered them together, and then I sent them out to Nineveh to haul timber. And so they'll make this argument, because he didn't specifically say he first brought him to Babylon, you can't prove that he was first taken to Babylon. And of course, he had to have taken him to Babylon because he had just finished rebuilding Babylon. And the reason he takes these princes to Babylon and forces them to do labor is to show his power over them. And so he's going to show them the city he just built. And then it says he sent them out to Nineveh. Well, where did he send them out from? And then we know from Ellen White that the only time that Babylon was the temporary capital of Assyria was during the time of Esarhaddon, because it was when Manasseh was taken captive, Babylon was the temporary capital, Ellen White says. And there's no other time other than in the time of Esarhaddon. But people will argue against this. But that rule, you know, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because there is no documentation something happened, we have to trust that the Bible, all this structure of this biblical prophecy must be true, because it would all fall apart. The whole thing would fall apart. So sometimes, even though there isn't external evidence, there's enough external evidence and enough internal evidence to show that these things all fit together. So when does the captivity of Daniel start and end? Somebody thought it was a trick question. I'm talking about the captivity when Daniel begins to be taken captive. I call it Daniel's captivity. It's the Babylonian captivity. So it began in the fall of 607 and ended in the fall of 537. Though technically there's another 6 months before the decree occurs that allows them to go back to Jerusalem. What's the difference between the 70 years in Babylon and the 70 years for Babylon? Does anybody want to answer that question? Yes, James.
Nobody's going to answer. In Babylon would be the captivity of the Jews, and for Babylon would be the years Babylon was in power.
Okay. And so Babylon's in power from October 609, when Assyria falls, to October 539, when Babylon falls. Now I asked a question, if September 28 is the first day of the 7th month in 607 BC, what is the first day of the first month? So what would I have to do to figure out this question first? What would I have to do? What would I have to know?
Determine the number of days between the two.
Okay, so, well, first I'd have to know that between the first day of the 7th month and the first day of the 1st month, there's a certain number of days on the Jewish calendar. So how many days would it be from the first day of the 1st month to the first day of the 7th month? How many days in the 1st month? And in the 2nd month? Okay. So we would know that if we had 6 months of 30 days, how many days would we have?
180.
Okay, 180. And there's how many months that don't have 30 days? 3. So it'd be 177 days. Now, I asked this question for a little bit more of a reason than just that, because sometimes people make a mistake. So there's 177 days. So the first day of the 7th month is which day, if we're going to number it, starting on the first day of the 1st month? It's day number what?
178.
Can you say that louder? So
178.
178. Would everybody agree with that? Because if you're counting the first day of the 1st month as 1, then it would be 178. Now, if I'm going to be using this program to bring up this date, what's the difference between the first day of the 1st month and the first day of the 7th month? How many days difference is it if I'm just doing math? How many days difference? So if I was going to go to September 28th on this calendar calculator, which is supposed to come up here, if I'm going to go from September 28th, so I'm telling you that September 28th is the first day of the 7th month, how many days would I have to count to go to the first day of the 1st month? Because we said it's 177 days if you just count the days, and it's the 178th day, so that's ordinal counting, we're counting the day starting at 1, is the first day of the 7th month. What would I have to do to get back to the first day of the 1st month?
So 177?
Okay, so we just would subtract 177. Why would we not subtract 178? Right, because when we do math has zeros in it, right? And we don't often really think about that. So when we're counting, and we're going to count from, so let's say today's Thursday, tomorrow's Friday, the next day's Saturday. How many days are there from today till Saturday?
One day. 2.
Okay, so somebody said 1 day, somebody said 2. How many would say 3? So it depends how you count it, right? And this is a problem we're going to run into all the time in chronology and counting dates, is people make mistakes because they don't really understand or think about what they're doing. So I'm going to put here on this, now this is in the Julian calendar, so I don't know if you can see this or not, but I'm going to try to blow it up and make it a bit bigger. So we got the Julian calendar here, there's the Julian day, there's the modified Julian day. And so we're going to go in the year 536, or this 607, this one's 607, right? 607. And I'm going to go to September, and that's September 28th. And so I hit the calculate, and that will tell me that it was a Sunday in 607. Now if I move up to the top here, here's the Gregorian day, and you'll see the Gregorian uses minus 606. So the Gregorian calendar on this program has a 0 year between AD 1 and BC 1. Okay? But the Julian calendar on this program doesn't. And that's another thing that can confuse people. So now I can use this modified Julian day. Now this modified Julian day is going from a certain date backwards. So if I wanted to go backwards, I would just add 177 to 14. So how much is that? You could use a calculator, but it would be 191, right? So if I go here and put 191, am I going too fast for people? And I calculate this, it will tell me that April 4th would be the first day of the first month in 607. Does that make sense? Does that help people a little bit? Does everybody understand what I did? So this is one way to do it. It's probably the simplest. I do also have a site that I never showed you, which I like. It's the 360-day calendar converter. It's just, I like this one. It's more visual. I can see all of the calendars at once. But the guy has some weird theories about a 360-day calendar year. So it's kind of a nutty idea. But anyway, he gets it from the Book of Jubilees, so maybe it's not that nutty. But it doesn't work. You end up having your year shifting 5 days every year. So we have another question. And yes?
So what do we do like to Sabbath in chronology? How should we count? 1 day, 2 or 3?
Well, the Sabbath, the first day is Sunday. It's the Sunday. And
from today to Sabbath, how many days we have in chronology?
well, today, what today is, you mean?
No, he's asking what's the correct way to count from today till Sabbath? Is it 2 or 3?
Oh, so if I'm going to count from today, there's not necessarily a correct way. You could say 3 days from now. You could say after 3 days. You know, from a biblical perspective, you could call it 2 days. All of those are acceptable. So that's the problem, is that there isn't really, and we do this ourselves, right? So in the Bible, they're not always using some consistent rule of how to count that. For example, you'll see in Mark, I believe, that says, you know, you have Jesus saying the same thing, but he says, on the third day, I will rise again. And in Matthew, it says, after 3 days. It's the exact same story. Jesus is saying the same things, except Mark records them as saying, on the third day, and the other one after 3 days. Well, after 3 days is inclusive reckoning. The third day is ordinal counting. Today, tomorrow, the third day. Which is not inclusive. People confuse it with inclusive. Inclusive is when you say 3, not third, and you mean third. Does that make sense? So those are things to distinguish between. And so you're supposed to say if you had any disagreements. Let me see. No, I haven't got any disagreements in yet. Hopefully we can get some of those in some of the further assignments. I can have something that you disagree with. And also points you do not understand. Now someone did not understand a particular point here. And I have to go to this email. And you're going to see who it is if you can read it. The point, Graham, what was the point you didn't understand again?
It was why we can place Jehoiachin's anointing in the fall of 60.
Okay, so I did answer that sort of. And that makes sense now or not? It makes sense. Okay, so it's just basically counting his birthday, so we don't need to look at that. Okay. And then I wanted you to use the Torah calendar for the year 536. And we're going to look at that. So I asked to look up the first day of the first month, the 14th day of the first month, the 6th day of the third month, the 5th day of the fourth month, the first day of the fifth month, the first day of the seventh month in 536 BC. And so what I would do with this is I have to make sure it's on BC now. And I'm going to put the year 536. And then I'm going to go view. Now, right now it's set for the 7th month. And you probably can't see that. I can zoom into it. And Can you see that better? So you can see here, if we're going to put in the first month, and we go view, it's very slow. I'm not sure why, but, and I don't know if you can see that at the bottom. And it'll say Thursday, March 29th. This is the day before the new moon. I have to make sure I have new moon day selected, because I like to look at the evening that you're going to see the new moon. And I kind of dropped the ball a little bit 2 days ago, because that evening was the first visible crescent. You could have seen it. And then you may have seen it yesterday when you went outside in the dark. You saw there was a crescent. That was the second day after the first visible crescent. And here we can see that there's a crescent there. Right? See this little crescent? That's what it looks like. And that would be on the evening that you would first be able to see it. And that was Friday, March 30th, 536 BC. Now, the question is it before or after the spring equinox? Well, it's after the spring equinox that far back. If you go further back, the spring equinox is going to start into April, because it shifts on the Julian calendar. So what would the first day of the first month be if March 30th is the evening that you see the sun? So you're going to, what's that? What's that?
See the moon.
The moon, I mean, the new moon, right? So the sun is just touching, it's behind, it's way back on the other side of the moon. And so you just see a little bit of that sun shining, because the sun is just set. So what would, that evening would start what day on the Jewish calendar? The first day of the first month, right? So that'd be the first day of the first month. Now, I don't need to look at each month then. What would I need to do to figure out all these other dates? Because all these other dates are going to be following a cycle of 30-29, 30-29, 30-29. The seventh month could be 30 or 29, but I'm only wanting you to go to the first day of the seventh month. So how would you do that? If you were going to do this counting, how would you do that? Because this won't tell me, if I start to look at this one and pick each month, it might be off a day, because this one's based upon the observance of the moon every month. So what would I do?
Count 177
Yeah.
after March 30.
Yeah. So there's easy ways to do it. The way I always did it is I'd get a calendar and I would count, physically count each day. So you would find a calendar. It doesn't really matter what year the calendar is, but you would start counting from, as long as you know you're not starting before, it's a leap year or something. So here we're starting in the spring. There's no leap year involved that you would ever have if you're counting the Jewish calendar from the spring. And you would just count the days. So we could add them up and find a number, but I would have to know on our calendar how many days that is away. So you could just use the calendar converter to get to the first day of the seventh month. And again, what would we do? So if we're going to go here, I can put this date. So the date in 536 was March 31st, right? Because March 30th was there, so that's a Saturday. And then I would have to subtract 177 days from this number here, because this number is going from a time in the 19th century or the 1900s, and it's counting backwards. Or I could use this one, the Julian day, and I would add 177 to this. So I could do either one. So if I was going to add 177 to this, what would I get? 738 plus 177. Can anybody do that math quickly? Without a calculator? So it would be simply,
950.
yeah, 915, because you would just add the 70 to the 73, which would give you 9, and then the 7 to the 8. So all I would do is change this to 915. I know it's like being in school or something doing math. And when I do that, then I would find that the first day of the 7th month is September 24th. And
9:55.
what's that?
9:55.
No, there's 9:15.
7:38.
Yeah,
Oh, 177.
yeah. And so we get the date September 24th. And so I'll look at all the people who've handed them in by emails, I'll look at them, but one person got that correct.
Mine's wrong.
September 24th,
Well,
you
that
have,
might be right, but they're not all right.
they're not all right, okay. But you got March 31st for the first day of the first month and September 24th for the first day of the 7th month. So I'd have to go through and look at these. I should probably do this myself so I just know these dates.
I didn't know this calendar, I didn't catch that last class. This
Yeah.
calendar starts over every month. And so you can see that real clearly if you just look at the bottom. This
Yeah.
month only has 29 days instead of 30, and it's the first day, it's the first month, so it should have 30 days, right?
Yeah, you can't, what you're saying here, that it only has 29 days, yeah, so it's going to say that, where does that say that?
Scroll up, keep going. You can click view calendar.
View here?
No.
Oh, up here. Oh, I see what you're saying. You use this. I never even ever use this. So they have this calendar that you can click on. It's view calendar, and it'll give you, looks like our modern calendars.
Right, and you're on the 7th month, but I'm on the 1st.
Yeah, but yeah, it doesn't matter, but
And so in the first
which one?
month, there's only 29 days.
So you can use these too, but you're going to see that, and in this one, you can see there's Yom Kippur, and yeah, this one has 30. So these are these calendars.
And then at the top, you can just click on the first.
The month.
There.
So if I click there on the first month, it'll show me this one. And so he made a mistake because, well, this one shows it has,
536.
am I in the right year? No, I'm in 2018, never mind. I'd have to go to the right year. So for some reason, it's just, I didn't pick the right year.
Can you show again where you click to go there?
Okay, so I'm going to go back here. So what I had to do is actually go up here and match this with this. So I'd have to pick, well, just change the year to BC 536. And then if I go to, we go into March,
I just clicked on the month.
yeah, and then I view calendar, or I could choose the Hebrew month there as well.
Right.
And then there's this calendar up here, so I can click, that's 537, that's 536. But this isn't going to line up perfectly with the biblical calendar. It may be off a day, right? Because this one views the moon every month. And the Jews didn't do that. They went 30-29 all the time. So these are important things that you have to be able to use these tools to understand how the calendar works. So I know that is not the easiest thing to do, but once you get used to it, it's not that bad. So let's go to Ezra chapter 1. So now we're going to look at this chronology that we just worked out, dealing with Cyrus. And we're going to start reading here. It says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah." So we know about this story. How does Cyrus know that God has asked him to build this house? That the Lord God, right, as he says, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of this earth, and has charged me to build this house which is in Judah. How does he know this?
Cyrus mentioned prophetically elsewhere in Scripture.
Okay, so let's look at this. Let's go to Daniel chapter 10 first. Maybe we'll go to Isaiah 45 first. Let's go to Isaiah. And actually, it's if we look at it, Isaiah 45 verse 1, we actually can look at the end of chapter 44. where he says in verse 28, so it's just the last verse of Isaiah 44, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. And then chapter 45, thus saith the Lord to his anointed. And what is that word anointed? Anybody know? Mashiach, which means Messiah. So he's called the Messiah. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass, and I will cut in sunder the bars of iron, and I will give thee the treasures of darkness. What is the treasures of darkness? Anybody know what this is referring to?
Verse were we on again?
This was chapter 45. I'm on verse 3. What is the treasures of darkness? Is anybody familiar with this term?
Dark saints. I don't remember.
Okay, this is a reference to the teachings of Babylon. The treasures of Babylon. It's the treasures of darkness. And I could give you a little bit of a Bible study on it. But we know that dark sayings refers to Babylon. And Babylon is mystery. It's all about mystery. So this treasures of darkness is, that means he's going to conquer Babylon. Right? That's what it's talking about. So this is not just talking about the fact that he's going to build the Jerusalem and the temple, lay the foundation of the temple. But it's even referring back earlier to his conquering of Babylon. So when he subdues nations, looses the loins of kings. Whose loins were loosed? By Cyrus. Yeah, that was Belshazzar's, right? His loins were loosed and his knees smote one against the other. So there's this reference here to Cyrus. Now let's turn to Daniel chapter 10. And we should be familiar with this if we're familiar with understanding that Trump is the last president. We should have spent some time studying this. So in Daniel chapter 10, it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So when is the 3rd year of Cyrus? Anybody know? So when did Cyrus conquer Babylon? So in the Jewish year 538, which began in the fall of 539, we know it was the evening of October 12th, and that night, the 13th, that Cyrus's armies went in and killed Belshazzar. And we know that Cyrus was the general and his uncle was the king of Media. So of the Medo-Persian Empire. And it says Darius the Median took the kingdom. Was Darius there when Belshazzar was killed, when Babylon fell? He wasn't personally there. He was an old man, and his nephew Cyrus was the one who was in charge of Darius's army. Right? So he had the army of Medo-Persia. And they had an agreement when Darius died, Cyrus would take over all of Persia. So when they conquered Babylon, it was the Medo-Persian Empire. But when Darius died, which was within about 2 years of the fall of Babylon, Ellen White says, in Prophets and Kings, Cyrus succeeded to the throne. And the beginning of his reign marks the completion of the 70 years. So we know then, if we're talking about the 3rd year of Cyrus, are we talking about the 3rd year from when Babylon fell, or are we talking about the 3rd year from when Darius died? Does anybody
So
know?
it's co-ruling between Darius and Cyrus.
Okay, so you're saying it's a co-rule. It depends how you count. So Cyrus was king for a long time of Persia before he conquered Babylon. And when Babylon was conquered, Darius became the king of Babylon. Cyrus was not the king of Babylon. Technically, right? He's the king of Persia still. And then when Darius died, Cyrus became both the king of Babylon, the king of lands, the king of Persia. He had these 3 different titles. And different documents will give him different titles and count his reign differently based upon different things, so depending on where their perspective when they're writing a document. These are usually bills of sales or contracts. So the 3rd year of Cyrus, if we read through this, we'll find that Daniel is fasting for 3 full weeks, and then on the 24th day, it says in verse 4, of the 1st month, as I was by the side of the great river Hiddekel, he has this vision. And this vision that he has on the 24th day of the 1st month is an angel coming to him, telling him that Michael has been fighting against the prince of the kingdom of Persia during this time, from the time that he began to pray, right? But now something has happened. Now, I'm trying to just go through this a bit quickly. Maybe you need to read it yourself. But we find that, and are you familiar, how many people are not familiar with this? Is everybody familiar with this story, this account in Daniel chapter 10? So, on the 24th day of the 1st month, the angel comes and says that this battle has been won. So, when Cyrus becomes king, when Darius dies, does he know at that time that he is going to build Jerusalem? When he becomes king of Babylon, when his uncle dies. Does he know? Okay, I would say no. Now, as he comes into contact with Daniel, because Daniel's in Babylon, that's, Daniel's not in the Medo-Persian kingdom, he's in Babylon. Yes?
So the 3rd year of Cyrus is the 3rd year as he is a king of Persia.
Well, no, he's been the king of Persia for a long time.
So what is this 3rd year?
So that's...
The reason I'm asking is because it says in Ezra's 1 verse 1 that in the 1st year,
yeah,
he was moved to,
right,
based upon what he read in Jeremiah, to do what he needs to do.
Right. So we have the one place it says in the 1st year that he was moved, but now we have this battle going on in what it says is the 3rd year. Now, the title he received when he conquered Babylon was the title King of Lands, I believe. Sometimes I get this a little bit confused, the different titles, but I believe it's the King of Lands. So, even though he conquered Babylon and Darius became king of Babylon, he's not king of Babylon, he's still king of Persia. And so when you talk about in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, that doesn't even make sense in the context of Cyrus, how he counts the years of his reign. I can't remember how long he's been reigning, but I believe it's something like 13 years. It's in the teens anyway, that he's been king of Persia. So when it says it's in the 3rd year, Daniel here would be counting from the 3rd year that Babylon fell. And we would have to know this because the whole context of this is this battle over Cyrus's mind so that Cyrus can issue this decree. So Daniel finishes his fast when the angel comes to him on the 24th day of the 1st month. So if the 24th day of the 1st month started on March 31st, it would be what date on our calendar? Anybody know? If March 31st is the first day of the 1st month, it would be April 23rd, right? If I'm doing my math right. So, yes.
And you know, it does say though, when Daniel was thrown in the lions, then that experience brought him in contact and gave him influence with Cyrus.
Right. So we know that, there may have been some influence, but we don't know at what point Daniel is now going to Cyrus and showing him the book of Isaiah. We don't know exactly when that happened. But he had to have showed him it before this event.
Yes, and also she says that he was fasting because Cyrus refused to
Right.
to pass the decree.
Yes. So there's a lot of details that we can find in the Spirit of Prophecy regarding this. So I would think that it would have been sometime just shortly before this. I don't think he would have showed Cyrus this when Darius is king. He would have shown it when Cyrus becomes king of Babylon. And now he says, I mean, that's my view. I'm not 100% certain on this. But I would think that this battle would be shortly after Cyrus receives this information from Daniel and then starts to think about it and decide what he's going to do. And so that battle that's going on over Cyrus's mind is the great controversy. It's Michael and Satan battling over Cyrus. And on the 24th day of the first month, the angel can come to Cyrus and say the battle's been won. Yes, James.
Is there any evidence showing that people knew, I mean, was it widespread knowledge that Cyrus was going to take over when Darius died?
I don't know. There's not a lot of information on that. So, but Cyrus did, and I would think that probably it would have been known by people in the court because it was an agreement. So Daniel would have known this working under Darius. So he would know that Cyrus is going to be king. So when is the decree for them to return to Jerusalem issued? What's the earliest it can be issued? According to what we just read here.
Sometime 537.
Yeah, at 536. So this is the spring of 536. Sometime after the 24th day of the first month, which is April 23rd. Correct? Mm-hmm. So we know then that they're going to do some things. So we're going to just try to quickly go through this. So let's go back to Ezra. So Ezra chapter 1. And it gives a lot of information, and it's good to read these things, but I don't know if chapter 2 is that necessary to read because it's a list of names. But if you want to read it, you can. And chapter 3, again, a list of names. So there's all these names, and we get to chapter 3, verse 1, and it says, "When the 7th month was come, the children of Israel were in the cities, and the people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. And then stood up Joshua the son of Jozadak, and his brethren the priests, and Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, and builded the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God." So, when did they build this altar in Jerusalem? According to the verse here. In the 7th month. And we'll find in verse 6, it says, "From the first day of the 7th month began they to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord." So that means on the first day of the 7th month, they build this altar. Now we know from the story of Ezra 7, when did they leave Babylon under Artaxerxes' decree? The first day of the 5th month. And when did they get to Jerusalem?
No, first month.
Oh, first day of the 1st month. Yes, that's what I meant. And when did they get to Jerusalem? On the first day of the 5th month, right? So how many months is that? 4 months. Okay, Cyrus's decree is issued on the 24th day of the 1st month. So if they were going to take 4 months to get to Jerusalem, how long would it take? When would they get there? I mean, it would take 4 months, but when would they get there? If they're starting on the 24th day of the 1st month, they would get there on
24th of the 5th month.
Yeah, the 24th of the 5th month. So at the end of the 5th month, if they left right when the decree occurred. Now probably there would be a period of time. So he issues a decree, they'd probably have to gather people together. And so when they build the altar on the first day of the 7th month, how long do you think they could have possibly been in Jerusalem to do that?
2 months at the most.
Well, a month and 6 days or whatever. So they don't really have a great deal of time. So probably they just arrive and they get to Jerusalem maybe a couple days before. It doesn't say. So we can see that this fits in with this timeline really well. Now, the first day of the 7th month is Rosh Hashanah, which we talked about last time, and Rosh means head, Shana is year, Hashanah just means, Ha means the. So Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year. And we saw that the calendar that the Jews use is a circular calendar because their calendar is the sky. And they see the sky rotate. And so at the turn of the year in the spring, they see that the year is beginning. And in the seventh month, it's the opposite. The sky has turned completely around. Does that make sense to you, what I'm talking about? That is, the way the constellations have moved, they've seen everything, all the stars, the planets moving through these constellations, and and how the sun moves through the sky and how the moon moves through the sky, they can then count the seasons. And so they call that the head of the year. But the turn of the year is in the spring. So the first day of the first month is the turn or the return of the year, using the word shuv or shuvah. And then in the fall, it's the head of the year. So they have this circular calendar. They think of the calendar like a big giant wheel. And that's why in Ezekiel's vision, these wheels within wheels is a timepiece. Right? It's God controlling all the events of humanity that appear to be complex, but there's a perfect order, and that's God's throne. So chronology and time is extremely important to God, because God has given us time in which to perfect a Christian character, for this work to be completed on this earth. Now, it's on page 12 in your notes. It might be on page 11 in the other notes. There is this timeline. If you look at this line here, and I probably need to draw it, so in a more simplified form. So we're going to get rid of all this. So now we can say, we got the first day of the first month, we got the 24th day of the first month, and over here we have the first day of the seventh month. And somewhere back here in the previous year, we have Cyrus begins his, and it'd probably be maybe in the seventh month back here, Cyrus comes to the throne. Now this then could be called Cyrus's first year of being the king of, like when it talks about it in Ezra chapter 1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, there's a question about how we count this. So is it saying the first year of his reign? Now Cyrus has been king for a long time in Persia, so it's not really the first year that he's the king of Persia. It's the first year that he's the king of Babylon, technically. And if he was going to count that, Cyrus would count it on the first day of the first month. But this is his accession year, or succession year, that he comes to the throne of Babylon when Darius dies. And so we would then say, well, this is going to be the start of Cyrus's first year. His first year. Right? That's the way it deals with it in Ezra. Because it says it's in his first year. It's not now, they could maybe include this as part of his first year. So sometimes the accession year is referred to as part of the first year. But technically this is the second year of Darius, that he's king of Babylon. But in Daniel 10, it says this is his third year. Because it's counting not from here, but from 2 years previous when Babylon falls. And then we have these events that occur in 536. Now, we're going to look at chapter 3 and starting in verse 8. So I'm going to try to get through some of this, hopefully it's not going to go too quickly. So it says, now in the second year of their coming unto the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, began Zerubbabel the son of the remnant or the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua the son of Josedek, and the remnant of their brethren, the priests and the Levites. So, anyway, it goes on that they're going to lay the foundation of the temple. And when do they do this according to verse 8 of chapter 3? The second month of what year?
Second year.
Yeah, so this is obviously again referring to this. So over here we have the first day of the first month again. And then we're going to have the first day of the second month. And then here, this is when they're going to lay the foundation of the temple. So that's in 535 BC, not in 536. Does that make sense? How we have that laid out. So we can see that this, this will now then be the second year, according to Ezra, not according to Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10 would have to call that the fourth year. And it's also interesting to note how Daniel's doing this, in that if you call that the third year, the first year of Darius that he's king, because it talks about Darius' first year, would also be Cyrus's first year in that context. But this is then a different first year. Now, why do you think this is? Why do you think we would have problems with this? Because our people have problems with this. Why do we have such a problem with this? With having the third year being the first year? I mean, I'm not saying us personally, but why do people who were in this movement not accept this? What do you think the reason would be? Other than, the things dealing with not accepting truth. But just from a human point of view. Or maybe from our culture.
If they're both Hebrews putting down a date, you would think that they would have their ducks in a row.
Okay, so we would think that they're going to be consistent on how they do things. One thing you'll find is that people aren't consistent with calendars because they have a different way of looking at calendars than we do. We have these fixed years in which we count things. They didn't. They count things from events. So kings could be counted from events that happen. So you might just say, this is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar because he came and he conquered us. We're not counting the year of his reign. But sometimes you might. You might refer to the year of in the 13th year of his reign. So you might refer to it that way. So you can refer to things in different ways and it wouldn't seem unusual to them. It wouldn't seem inconsistent. When you think about in the Gospels, the example I gave before, calling something the third day and after 3 days, they're not consistent.
What is that first year of Cyrus? Is that Ezra 1?
Yeah, the first year is Ezra 1. The second year is Ezra chapter 3. The third year here is Daniel chapter 10. So this is in Daniel 10 verse 1. And this is in Ezra 1 verse 1.
So, but it says that in Ezra's 1:1 that he was moved there,
Yeah.
but he already conquered at that time, isn't he?
No, he's moved to give a decree.
Oh, to give a decree.
Yeah, to
Not
say to
conquer.
not
Okay.
yeah. So that's why we say this is the same year, because that's what's happening in Daniel chapter 10.
Right.
He's being moved to give this decree. And so they have to be the same year. But there are people who don't accept this because we have a way of thinking about time that is different than the way that they think about time. So that to them there would be no problem with this. Now, many people recognize this. That's why some people will say, well, and it says in Jeremiah 24 that the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, which is the fourth year of Jehoiakim, that must be the same as the third year of Jehoiakim in Daniel 1:1. And we dealt with that a little bit, that it's not the same year. It's 1 year later, because it's not it's not talking about the 70 years, the very year they began. It's not even talking about the 70 years Babylonian captivity. It's talking about the 70 years for Babylon, which already started a few years before. So that fourth year of Jehoiakim in Jeremiah is the same as the third year in Daniel. But some people will use that argument because they see arguments like this. So you have to be careful that you understand what's happening. And there's other ways that we can show that Jehoiakim's 4th year is the same as, or in Jeremiah is the same as the third, is not the 3rd year in Daniel 1:1. It's not the same year, it's a different year. That they're counting the same. Daniel and Jeremiah are counting the years of Jehoiakim the same. Now, in chapter 4, let's turn there quickly. So I'm going to try to get through some of this as quickly as I can. And now it says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, then they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers and said unto them, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do, and we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon king of Ashur, which brought us up hither." Who is this group of people that was brought up by Esarhaddon to the land of Israel? What's that?
Northern tribes.
So it's not northern tribes.
Said it was Manasseh earlier. Esarhaddon took Manasseh.
Yep, Esarhaddon took Manasseh. Right, so that's Manasseh. He took him in 677. So Esarhaddon also did something else. Who are these people that come to Zerubbabel and Joshua? They're the Samaritans, okay? And that means that these people, are they Jews? Okay, they're not Jews. They're people who repopulated northern Israel in the days of Esarhaddon, because Assyria depopulated northern Israel and then replaced them with people from Hamath and Hazor, these different places in part of the Assyrian realm, and put them in northern Israel so that the Israelites couldn't come back and occupy the land. That's what's happened. Now, some Israelites still would have been there, and those Samaritans would have mixed with those Israelites and learned some of the religion from them, but they're not Jews. Even though some of those people might be closely related in some ways now, or because some of those people still exist today, but these Samaritans are not the tribes of northern Israel. The lost 10 tribes, sometimes we talk about the lost 10 tribes, they're lost. They're scattered, and literal 10 tribes are never going to be recognized again. So it's something we know. There's other people who don't believe that, not in this message, but in other religions that believe, some of these different places, like people in Ireland, they're from a certain tribe and so forth. But anyway, these are the Samaritans, and they're not called the Samaritans at this time. Samaritan's a Greek name that was used later. But that's who these people are. And they want to be involved. Now these people then are the enemies. Because they're not allowed to be involved, they seek to oppose the rebuilding of the temple and of the city later as well. In verse 4 it says, "The people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus king of Persia, even unto the reign of Darius king of Persia." So how long did this work go on? So we got here Cyrus and Darius. Now this is of course Darius the Persian, not Darius the Mede. What's that?
16 years.
16 years? Yes, roughly about 16 years. And I have it on the chart on this page in much more detail than I'm going to draw it here. But we have Cyrus from the time that they conquered Babylon. Cyrus reigns 9 more years. And then he dies. And Cambyses reigns. Now, when we read this next verse here, verse 6. Let's read it, and then we see what you think about it. And then it says, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So who is this person, Ahasuerus? So you're going along, and you got Cyrus, and we know there's some kings in between here, but it says from Cyrus to Darius. And then some people, when they read this, who followed Darius? Xerxes, right? And what's he called in the book of Esther? Ahasuerus. So people just read this and they say, well, this Ahasuerus must be Xerxes. And then it says, verse 7, and in the days of Artaxerxes wrote Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions unto Artaxerxes, king of Persia, right? And so it talks about this Artaxerxes. Well, I mean, obviously we know Artabanus is in between there after Xerxes, but Artaxerxes then follows. So people just say, well, this must be Xerxes and Artaxerxes. In the spirit of prophecy, Ellen White's really clear that Ahasuerus is who? Does anybody know? Cambyses. Or Cambyses, however people want to say it. So we got Cyrus. He's called something like that. I know you can't read that because it's spelt wrong anyway. And then we have Artaxerxes, but he's actually false Smyrtus. Okay? So this is talking about the work of the enemies that's happening between Cyrus or from Cyrus all the way to the time of Darius. And so it just repeats and enlarges. It doesn't continue on. And I've actually had discussions with people who believe otherwise, and then they put the rebuilding of the temple not with Darius the Persian or Darius the Great, but with a later Darius that's way long after Artaxerxes. So they put all these things way into the future. Now, I mention these just because we have to be really careful as we read, and you're going to find commentaries that aren't going to agree with this. Ellen White's very clear, but you know, you're going to run into those problems and you need to be aware of them. Yes, Larry?
To prove that, what you're saying, it's found in Prophets and Kings 572.2.
Right, so Prophets and Kings 572.2.
Tells you that in Ezra 4:7, Ahasuerus is, or Artaxerxes is false Smyrtus.
Yes, Artaxerxes is false Smyrtus. Yeah. Okay. So we have that straightened out. We have this work of the enemies that happens. And of course, we could put this all in a reform line. We're going to see that, you know, the laying of the foundation of the literal temple, and then the work of the enemies that happens. And then we're going to know that later, in the story of Esther, we end up with the Sunday law, right? So when I presented this in Alberta back in August, I was actually dealing with the reform lines, not just the chronology. And I asked the question, and I don't know how we've sorted out Esther as far as how it lies within the three decrees. Because under Darius's rebuilding of the temple, we definitely have the second decree, which parallels the second angel's message. So how we fit Esther into there, I'm not quite sure how we've decided that. But we know that the story of Esther deals with the Sunday law, and it happens under the second decree, in a sense. It's under that period of time. And we know that Esther is in Babylon, and where she's supposed to be, in Jerusalem, because they've just had this second call. And Zerubbabel, which means out of Babylon, you know, they had the second call when they rebuilt the temple. And we're going to look at that as well. So this is very, very simple to understand once you go through it. And I suggest that, you read the book of Ezra multiple times, because you're going to start to notice more details in it. And when we do this on the next one, which is next week on Monday, we're going to go through Artaxerxes' decree. We're going to go through the start of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days. And there's some very important things that we need to see there, because we're familiar with the first day of the first month and the first day of the fifth month. But there's more to that story than just those two dates. Now, we're going to know, we know under false Smyrdes that they stopped building. Now there is, in my notes, I deal with this in much more detail, but what happens is that false Smyrdes, he looks up the records when these people come to him and complain, and what he finds is the Babylonian Chronicles. So he has a record that Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem. He doesn't have the record of anything good about the Jews, and he doesn't have the record of Cyrus's decree. So false Smyrdes, when he looks this up, when he's dealt with this, the one who's called Artaxerxes, not Artaxerxes, he just looks it up and says, oh, they're bad. And so he stops the building of the temple. And then we know that they commenced the temple under the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. So Haggai and Zechariah, when you read them, all they're really dealing with is encouraging God's people to start rebuilding the temple. So they have laid the foundation, they've stopped, you need to continue building it. And looking at Haggai and Zechariah, we don't have time to look at that in detail, but if you start to read it, you will find that they begin in 520, and that's on page 16 of your notes. And they begin in 520 to prophesy. And technically, Zechariah just right at the end of 520, and he prophesies all the way into 518, right at the end of 518. Haggai's, all of his prophesying is in 520. So if you look at that chart there, we see that that's happening. So we're going to know that here in 520, which is in the second year of Darius the Persian, that Haggai and Zechariah begin to prophesy. So this is, we'll call this the second here, and then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. And his reign goes spring to spring. So this is, so we'll do it this way. We'll go, this is 520, 521, whoops, I'm going backwards. 519, 518, 517, 516, and this should be over here more. And this is 515 BC. So in the second year, Haggai starts prophesying, Zechariah starts prophesying right here, and he continues prophesying right to the end of here. And there are some things, we talked about them before. There's 70 years for the temple. So we talked about this last time. So the temple was destroyed in 586 on the 10th day of the 5th month. And then it was rebuilt and dedicated, and we're going to look at that here. So let's look at chapter 6 of Ezra, and we're going to start in verse 15. So we're skipping a bunch of history of how they end up doing this, but it says in verse 15, "And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which is the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king." So that was Ezra chapter 6, verse 14. 15, pardon me. Oh, and I should read verse 14. It says, "The elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia." And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So, Adar, does anybody know which month Adar is? It's the 12th month, because it's the one where you can get a second Adar, a V Adar. And so, it's finished here in the 12th month, and it's going to be on the 3rd day. So which year is the temple dedicated on our calendar? In 515. And that date, so it's the 3rd day of the 12th month here. In ours, it's the 12th day of the 3rd month, which is March 12th. So this is March 12th. That's the date. It's actually a Sabbath, March 12th. So on our calendar, if we were going to write it like this, we'd write the 12th day of the 3rd month. It just happens to be an inversion of the date here. There's the 3rd day of the 12th month. So that's a coincidence, right? We have this coincidence in the Bible. Does it mean something or not, right? I noticed this a few years ago. I thought it was an interesting coincidence, and I believe it means something. So we can see then, now this is the Jewish year. If we're going to call this the Jewish year spring to spring, this would be the Jewish year spring to spring, 516. You'll find on the Torah calendar, when you start going in months that go past here, they will still keep this 516 date. So once you get into like the 10th, 11th, and 12th month, they don't give the date 515. They continue on because they look at that as the same year, going spring to spring. Or actually, I think in that one they go fall to fall. So it means that actually once you get past here, they're going to have that problem. You're going to see, I can't remember if that one goes spring to spring or fall to fall. But the point is, this is the Jewish year, 516. Now, we saw that there was, and we mentioned it, if you go back in your notes to page 13, there's this little diagram, and it shows Cyrus's decree is in 536, the remnant return, the foundation is laid, and the building resumes in 520, Darius's decrees in 516, the temple rebuilt in 515. Now this is a statement from Review and Herald, January 23rd, 1908. Sister White says, nearly 20 years passed by. So if you look and read in the context, this is from, my understanding is from when they returned, or maybe from when the decree was issued, nearly 20 years passed by. So it's not 20 years. And then says, many of the remnant who returned to Judea had fallen into a backslidden condition and were doing no more to restore the house of God than were the brethren living elsewhere in the Medo-Persian realm. But as the result of the appeals of Haggai and Zechariah, the returned exiles repented before God and labored diligently to complete the temple. The Lord blessed them, and they were greatly prospered. Their efforts were brought to the notice of Darius Hystaspes, or Darius the Great, Darius the Persian, who was the monarch ruling at that time, and he was impressed to issue a second decree fully as favorable as the one issued by Cyrus over 20 years before. When you look at the history of this, it's very interesting, because when do they start the rebuilding? So Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them. So somewhere in here they start rebuilding the temple. During Darius, right? And the enemies are going to come and say, why are they rebuilding? And Darius, when you read it in there, you'll find that he searches out for the decree. And it's going to take him some time, because the decree is not actually in Persia. Well, it's not in the capital, right? It's not in the capital city, which the name escapes me at the moment. Shushan, right? It's not in Shushan. It's in another town, which I can't remember the name, Amanatha or Amathana, something like that. I know I pronounced it completely wrong. But it's in this other town, and they find the actual decree. So remember, false Smyrtus just found the Babylonian Chronicles. But this decree, of course, is Cyrus's decree. He's saying this is the Lord God of heaven who's told me to rebuild this house. And Darius then issues a second decree. And this second decree, Ellen White says, their efforts were brought to the notice of Darius Hystaspes, who was the monarch ruling at that time. He was impressed, obviously by the Holy Spirit, to issue a second decree fully as favorable as the one issued by Cyrus over 20 years before. So Cyrus's decree was issued when? In the spring of 536. So what's the soonest you could have Darius's decree? If it's over 20 years from when Cyrus's decree occurred.
Well, it's depending on when in the year, 516 would be the earliest.
Well, right. So it's going to be here, but it has to be after the spring. Correct? And it's got to be sometime before they complete the temple. So if you're going to place this decree, I would just say you would place it in the summer or maybe early fall of 516. So you're going to have Darius's decree here. That makes sense. Ellen White plainly tells us this. Now this is important because when we dealt with all those periods of 70 years and 140 years, we have them ending with decrees. Most people, actually, I find nobody but Ellen White or Spirit of Prophecy placed Darius's decree in 516. I can find no source, nothing that does that except the Spirit of Prophecy. So if she was copying her chronology from other people, she obviously got this wrong because everybody puts Darius's decree here. They assume that the decree is issued at the time they begin rebuilding the temple. They resume the work. But we can see that that wouldn't have happened. It probably that he wouldn't even have known about the rebuilding until sometime in 519. Then they have to search out the records. And we don't know how long that took. But Ellen White tells us that it's more than 20 years between the two decrees. And that means that that decree comes at the time that's 70 years from when the temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed in August of 586. And probably the decree happened in August of 516, exactly 70 years from when it was destroyed. And then it's actually 70 years and 7 months from when it was destroyed, it's dedicated. And it's dedicated on the third day of the 12th month, or the 12th day of the third month, March 12th, which is a Sabbath, in 515. So if you were going to look at this and count from when it's dedicated, and you say, well, it's destroyed in 586, and then it's rebuilt in 515, you would just say that's 71 years, right? But it's actually 70 years and 7 months. And originally when I looked at this, I was putting it in the spring of 516, before I really started working out some of these details. And actually most times when you look it up, if you look up at the rebuilding of the Second Temple, they will say that it was dedicated in 516. Now, that's true if you're using the Jewish year, but they're talking about our calendar. But they're just not being very specific. They're not really thinking about it. They're just recognizing it's the 16th year of Darius, and the 16th year of Darius, or the 6th year of Darius, is 516, right? So they don't even think about the fine details. So you can see that there's a lot of detail here, and God has directed us at this time to understand this. Is there any questions on what we've done so far? Because I want to review it a little bit. So when we go from Ezra chapter 1 to chapter 6, we have the history from the first decree to the second decree. And we can easily put this on a reform line. I probably should have made that an assignment. Can you draw this on a reform line? Because it's our standard reform line of what we believe in the Millerite history. When is the time of the end in the reform line of the decrees? Okay, so Cyrus? Cyrus when?
538.
Okay, 538? So the fall of Babylon, October 13th, 539. That's the fall of literal Babylon. 1798 is the fall of spiritual Babylon, right? So there's a parallel there. That's the time of the end. You know, if we're paralleling this with Miller's reform line. And then do we have, you know, we have an increase of light that occurs, right? Under Cyrus, you know, he comes to the throne. There's an increase of light that occurs. And what is that light on? What's the light that Cyrus receives? It's on Jerusalem, his role. Now, and also to release those that are captive in Babylon, to release them and allow them to return to Jerusalem. And remember that the light in every reform line, the increase of light that occurs is in response to what? What's the increase of light in response to? What's that? The darkness. So whatever the darkness is, the light will always respond to that. So what's the darkness of the 70 years captivity? They're in captivity, right? That's the darkness. So what's the light? Coming out of captivity, right? So we'll see this in every reform line, that the darkness is important to understand if you want to understand the reform line, the purpose of that reform line. You want to understand the increase of light. So we have this increase of light. And we could say maybe the message is formalized, you know, when Cyrus first receives the message from Daniel. And we could say that maybe it was empowered when he you know, gives the decree. I don't know, you know, how you would do that. This is something I'm not great at. You know, we could look at this in different ways. Now we kind of see that there are two times of the end, because we recognize that even Cyrus, when he comes to the throne, could be called the time of the end. When he succeeds to the throne at the end of the 70 years captivity proper, right? That's the actual captivity. When Babylon falls, that's the end of the 70 years for Babylon. It's not really the end of the 70 years in Babylon. You see what I'm saying? So we first saw the 70 years ending with Cyrus, and at first we just conflated them two. A lot of people just put Cyrus, fall of Babylon, same year. Never made a distinction between, you know, the 2 years. And we saw that there was these 2 years, but we still kept Cyrus issuing the decree as being the, you know, him coming to the throne and issuing the decree as the time of the end. Then we saw last year, 2 years ago, we saw for the first time that we could maybe put the time of the end at the fall of Babylon itself. So we kind of see that there's two times of the end there together. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. So we can do that. Now, then when we look at this reform line, we see them laying the foundation. We see the work of the enemies. And then after the work of the enemies, the second angel's message has to arrive. And the second angel's message arrives with two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. Would you agree with that? They start this rebuilding of the foundation. So they resume this work. Now, how we would look at maybe the formalization and the empowerment of that could be considered in different ways. And again, how we place the story of Esther within the reform line of the decrees, I'm not sure how we've decided to do that. But the story of Esther definitely would lie under which message? First, second, or third angel's message? The Sunday law. How would we look at that? Anybody have any ideas? What would we normally say the Sunday law is? Is it the first, second, or third angel's message? Third, right? So when does the third angel's message arrive in the reform line of the decrees? What's that? You have to say it louder. I can't even hear you.
It arrives under the second.
It arrives at the second? Under the second. Okay.
As you just
So it arrives under the second. And so is it empowered? So if it arrives under the second, you're saying? Yeah, always in every history does it arrive under the second? I don't know, you know. So that's something we have to think about when we look at this reform line and we compare it with the Millerite reform line. But the third decree happens under Artaxerxes, and that's the one we're going to look at next week, next Monday. So, in trying to understand this, I hope you get the idea of what we're doing, why we're laying out this chronology. And I'm not going to really deal with the reform lines per se, but you need to think about these things in the context of the reform lines. And because there's a whole bunch of imagery that is used. What's the main imagery used here that we use from this story of the decrees? What's the main model that's being used? What's that? Building, right? So this is the building, and it's the building of specifically the temple. So we often think, and I want to address that just this one point, when it says in verse 14 of chapter 6 that they built it and finished it, the temple, according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. If the temple was rebuilt under the time of Darius, why is Ezra referring to Artaxerxes? Why is Artaxerxes brought into this, in this statement? Now, when is Ezra writing? In the time of Artaxerxes, right? So why does he mention Artaxerxes here when the temple is rebuilt 59 years before Artaxerxes' decree? What's that?
Daniel 9.
Okay, Daniel 9. Okay, how does Daniel 9 relate to Artaxerxes being involved? Okay, but that's Jerusalem. Doesn't say anything about the temple. In Artaxerxes' decree, all it mentions about the temple is what? It mentions the temple, but what does it mention about the temple? Artaxerxes. It doesn't say anything about building the temple.
No.
It only talks about some offerings and some things for furnishing the temple. So some gold and silver is provided by Artaxerxes. So why does Ezra say that it's built according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes? Because if the temple is completed, they're offering, and they're going to keep the Passover, and I need to mention that in verse 19, and the children of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. So 40 days after they dedicate the temple, they keep the Passover. Right? So this means this temple is as operational as it ever gets. I mean, they don't have the ark in it, so they can't have the Day of Atonement. But they're operating. So why is Artaxerxes mentioned in this, when they're building the temple 59 years before his decree? Do you have any ideas? So you say it's Daniel chapter 9, but Daniel chapter 9 doesn't deal with the temple.
But that's what I'm saying. I don't think that Ezra is dealing necessarily with only the rebuilding of the temple specifically.
But he's saying it's the temple. It says it is rebuilt according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes.
Well, according to the third decree, the laws of the God of heaven, that's what he spoke about.
Right. So Artaxerxes' decree has nothing to do with the temple. Specifically, it has only to do with the city and the laws.
The laws were in the temple, the Ten Commandments.
Okay, so you're saying the laws are in the temple, and so that's why Artaxerxes mentioned?
That's what I'm just saying, that the commandments are in.
See, the way that I would look at it is quite simple, is that Ezra recognizes that... Okay, do you have a
I
comment?
was just going to say, at this time, the Ten Commandments ain't in there.
Yeah, the Ten Commandments aren't there. The Ark isn't there.
About the restoration of the law.
Yeah. So, I would just say it's more simple than that, is that there are 3 decrees that are needed. And that Ezra recognizes that it's not just about the temple, it's about the whole city. So even though the temple is built, he's mentioning Artaxerxes' decree, which specifically has nothing to do with the temple. But it does, because this is it completes that work that's needed. And so he's recognizing something that maybe we don't think about, but he understands Daniel. And so he understands that there is another decree, and that other decree is Artaxerxes. So we can't just say Cyrus and Darius. We need to include Artaxerxes because they're a unit. Those three decrees are not three separate decrees, arbitrarily made by these three kings. They're part of a process that God has used to get them out of the Babylonian captivity as a type for the Millerite time period and for our time as well. So, God put that there for a reason. It confuses people because people think Artaxerxes' decree has something to do with the temple. Yes, Graham?
Do you think it helps to show a combining of the messages in that time?
Yes. That's what I'm trying to say, is that they're combined in a three-step process. And so those three decrees go together as a unit. They are not separate decrees, even though they are separate decrees. But in God's mind, they are one. And so as Seventh-day Adventists, and we're going to see this when we look at Artaxerxes' decree, we often just pick one decree. There's these decrees, which one are we going to use to start the 70 weeks? But we can see that God has all three decrees needed, and that there's a three-step process. And we're going to see that expressed in Artaxerxes' decree itself. That it's not just a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. That it's actually three steps that are needed in that decree. So you're going to have your questions and assignments, which I expect to be done. And the chronology of that is you're going to look at 457. So you're going to lay out the dates for 457 and 456. And that'll be helpful when we start going through Ezra 7 to 10. So that's what we're going to cover next week. And some of the questions I asked here a little bit, I want you to respond to this idea about the temple. I just specifically question 5, the idea that the second temple was complete 59 years prior to Artaxerxes' decree. Is that new to you? Right? I want to know, yes or no to that one, because it's something that was new to me a few years ago. Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful that we are here and that we are studying together, and the privilege that we have in opening your word together with your Spirit here binding our hearts to you and to one another. We just ask, Lord, that we can continue to study all the light that's coming, and even the old light, to understand it. We ask, Lord, that your Spirit can be with us throughout this day, throughout this school, and that we cannot neglect our prayer and study. And as much as we enjoy each other's company, Lord, help us to remember that we're here to learn and to share. We pray for your continued care and protection, and we ask this and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.